Okay, so I know we'll probably still have a few people joining this particular session, but we will get started to keep to our timelines. And just again, welcoming everybody for the day. It's very exciting to see. We've had 134 registrants so far, and we do appreciate we've moved to a different platform this year. So I know some people, it's taking them a few minutes to learn the new method. And we're really excited to have Harry Zeet be our keynote today and talking about the evolving promise of trauma-informed healthcare and caregiver self-care. And it so much intersects with the research we do, because when you think of all of our major theme areas at Parkwood, I'm sure you can all see the intersections and the overlaying with trauma-related issues. Sometimes that involves trauma and violence as well. Sometimes it can really be more focused on the trauma. One of the, so with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Zeet, and he currently works full-time practicing individual and group trauma therapy and psychotherapy. He's a faculty member of the MD Psychotherapy Association of Canada year-long training program, and previously worked as an American board certified emergency physician in Cambridge and Toronto. He's an advocate for trauma-informed and humane medical and mental health care. He is passionate about teaching, about cultivating the healing potential of traditional modalities integrated with newer somatic and neuroscience-informed models. Between 2012 and 2019, Dr. Zeet facilitated the Caring for Self While Caring for Others in the Ontario Medical Association, offering presentations on wide-ranging themes related to wellness and embodiment, diversity, and social change. These sessions brought together medical doctors, psychotherapists, administrators, and other healthcare providers. Evolving out of this project, Dr. Zeet began running trauma-informed groups aimed at creating a felt sense of safety and connection, combining sensorimotor psychotherapy, internal family systems therapy, yoga, and relational models. These groups are designed for both patient populations as well as for first responders, medical doctors, and other healthcare providers. In both the Caring for Self While Caring for Others series and his short and long-term groups, he's assisted by his partner, Irina Dramatach, and we certainly met her and appreciate her assistance, which includes technical assistance, by the way, a certified yoga teacher and health coach. And you can find out more about their work on the website, which is in the overall agenda and background. You'll find that. So we really welcome your talk today, Harry, and I think your focus on both care for the provider as well as what we would consider what we could traditionally see as the patient is important, and allowing us, as we hear about these these different perspectives, to also be thinking about how this really, I challenge each of us to be thinking how this not only affects us personally, our clinical practice, but also our research. So without further ado, Harry, I'm going to turn off my sound and video and hand over to you. I will be monitoring for questions for that 15-minute period at the end, assisted by Melissa Taylor-Gates. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. So today, this morning, in a short period of time, we're going to cover a lot of ground, talking about trauma-informed healthcare, research, and clinician self-care in an age of upheaval. Being in the trauma world means generally not a lot of conflict of interest, and not a lot of money goes into trauma. And I skipped this slide I already heard your land acknowledgement, and I acknowledge the land I'm speaking on from Toronto. The traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I was recently listening to a discussion at a new project started by Thomas Hubel, who some of you may have come across with, who was a spiritual teacher for a long time, taught a lot of meditation, and then saw so much trauma. He became very passionate about addressing collective trauma through community, through spirit mindfulness practice. And Esther Perel and her husband, Jacques Saul, who's a trauma therapist. Many of you know Esther. She's a quite famous couple therapist, writer. She wrote a book called Mating in Captivity, which was translated into many, many languages. And what Esther said at the end of the talk, and may resonate for all of us, is that trauma has really entered the discussion. We can't really go anywhere today without hearing about trauma and without sometimes being overwhelmed by the sense of it being everywhere and being confused about what that means. So Esther said, for many years, maybe the past 20 years, we've been very focused on neuroscience and attachment. And suddenly things changed quite quickly, and we started having experiences like thinking our neighbors whose marriage seemed very strong are suddenly splitting up, seeing a lot of children with troubles that we didn't expect or didn't see before or didn't notice. So she said, collective trauma is not just anymore what happens to the people out there away from us, that we're all in it. And the world is once again a central character in the therapeutic process. So in a way, we're all together in this discussion. None of us are really immune from it. And that's a lot what this talk is about, how we can sense that togetherness as we face a world that's very scary. And for my title, I chose In the Time of Upheaval, because I had actually just watched a little video webinar by Mark Walsh, who's a British embodiment coach and quite influential in the trauma world these days, who talk was meditating while the world is on fire or while the world burns. So we'll begin to look at how can we practice compassionate trauma-informed care for our patient population, our clients, our research population, and ourselves in a world that sometimes feels like it's burning. So we all know about the blind man and the elephant, and people have been talking for many, many years about the fact that trauma hides in plain view, and often we're blind to the effects of trauma. And that's in a way how the trauma-informed care movement came about, to say we couldn't possibly see trauma all the time, or possibly or probably even most of the time. So Kathleen Adams, in a book published in the last year, says, every powerful clinician articulates profound truths about the fractured and shattered souls who appear in their office. The differences among these clinical geniuses melt away when understood through the lens of attachment, disorganization, and dissociative processes. So I'm really bringing us where we, especially me as a clinician and other clinicians, see trauma now, which is much more expanded view than just people who have been to war or been raped or mugged, had a single incident, but seeing trauma extending in a very complex way, right back to the beginnings of conception or life. And that becomes an issue because research often demands simplicity and control of variables, while understanding trauma and trauma therapy demands the interaction of vast numbers of variables. In his book, The Wounded Research, or Research with Soul in Mind, California writer and psychotherapist Robert Romanishin says, or asks, what happens when our research is driven by our trauma and our complexes rather than by our wisdom, when it is performed by individuals and institutions disconnected from soul? And we can act further and answer as he does, how can we reconnect with soul? And that affects not just the research institution, but the people that often fund us and that we answer to. So our learning objectives today are to describe the nature of trauma, which is hotly debated in many hundreds of articles every day on social media, on the news, to identify and integrate concepts learned about a trauma-informed approach to develop better research practices, to engage in discussion about why trauma-informed approaches matter, and to apply a trauma awareness, even when we don't believe we've experienced trauma, to our own self-care. So because this is a charged theme, I'm just going to lead you through a little exercise very quick, which you can participate in if it feels okay. And here we're addressing your nervous system and your subcortical brain, your deep brain, because if we've had trauma, even if we don't know it, this is where it often lands, what we call being triggered, rather than in our thinking brain, where the result may follow. So I just invite you to feel the support of the floor under your feet, and to feel the support of your chair under your sits bones, against your back, if it supports your back. I invite you to identify your exit, how you'd leave your room. And I invite you to take a deep breath, and if you can, let it out with sound. Invite you to do one more time. Deep breath, letting it out. You might want to put a hand on your belly or not. Soften your belly and soften your heart. Soften your gaze. One more breath in and out. Great. And you might feel a little shift there. So the way I teach, which might be a little unfamiliar or less familiar than some of the lectures you do, has always been somewhat of a dance between the right brain, the left brain, and the body. I find if we get too into the left brain, we can be somewhat rigid and disconnected and lose the connection to what trauma is, which is really bad things, whether they're happening in the first days of life or the last days of life. If we're too just in our right brain or our emotions or our body, we can sometimes be flooded and overwhelmed and not be able to make meaning. So I invite you all to dance back and forth. And before I start, maybe to tell you just a little about myself. So in terms of lived experience, my first job before becoming a doctor was I worked for 3 years as a nursing attendant at Riverdale Hospital. It's a chronic care hospital in Toronto. It's now Bridgepoint. It was right next to the Don Jail. So that was actually a coming out of the suburbs, a pretty intense experience for me. And I was exposed to a lot of diversity and also to working with bodies that were disabled, that couldn't get out of bed, that couldn't feed themselves. From there, I moved on to emergency medicine after my internship, and I came to that because I was rather alienated by the culture in medicine and exploring a lot of life, and somehow found myself in the ER. I can understand better why I gravitated there and seeking control and chaos, loving the community. And I worked in both downtown core hospital in Parkdale in Toronto, lots of drugs, lots of violence, lots of mental illness, and also in a community hospital where we were expected to do a lot by ourselves. And then after 22 years of that and feeling really overwhelmed and feeling like I could no longer give what I could before, I gravitated into psychotherapy. I realized that people did not heal unless we addressed trauma in the body, and I did my full training over about 10 years in sensory motor psychotherapy. So that's a bit about me, right? Just a little bit. So what is trauma, we might ask, and a lot of people do, and there's a lot of fighting even about that. We know that trauma follows an event. It's not the event itself. The trauma refers to an event that cannot be integrated. It's too overwhelming. So as a result, there is some degree of fragmentation and dissociation. We may know that in the moment, but sometimes it lurks and we just feel, maybe we felt out of sorts, kind of contracted for many, many years. We say, I don't know, I don't have a trauma history, nothing bad happened to me, but it's not uncommon that I get contacted by a doctor in palliative care, oncology, geriatrics, and they say, we have this person, no history of PTSD, and suddenly they're having flashbacks, they're frozen, they're having nightmares. So it may be that we've been strong enough to put that trauma aside, but it's lurked there, and it's actually created some of the results. We just haven't seen them. So one definition of trauma from Victoria Hamilton is trauma, she reserves it for responses to events which arouse in most of us intense feelings of horror, a sense of outrage, and very often a feeling of revulsion and turning away. We would rather not know and hear stories that threaten to debride our old wounds, long ago scarred over and forgotten. And we might ask, why am I talking about trauma now? And it's quite interesting because when we look at trauma-informed care in just a few minutes, we're going to see that actually in trauma-informed care, we're not talking about trauma, but the foundation of trauma-informed care is that we have a rich and deep understanding of trauma. Without understanding what trauma is and how it impacts us, there'd be no rationale. We wouldn't know why we were doing trauma-informed care. So this translates as bond in the making. It would just, I'm trying to show German at you. It just was the best picture that I could get that on my PowerPoint slide. And there's a picture of mom and child. And this is a reminder, or for some of you, just a preview of how much we've been impacted by the research in this field, and how now it's very rich and it's been ongoing for a long time, and how people code. And so you can look at micro interactions between caregivers and their children, especially early in life. I've been in talks on disorganized attachment using this research in 3 continents, well, 2 continents, 3 countries, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United States. And we feel as every time we see those misattuned interactions where the infant looks for support and sees a frightened face or a disengaged face, and it becomes haunting. People become very quiet. So this is often the root of trauma that we don't talk about. Trauma is so widespread when we look at how it impacts us. So often people will look at the PTSD diagnosis, which was really just a snapshot, a very small snapshot of very few things that happen. And it came out of the Vietnam War. But actually, when we look at trauma and look at trauma research, we're seeing just widespread effects, because trauma affects us at every level of physiology, at every level of emotion and cognition and meaning making. So it's a busy slide, but you can see everything from depression, self-hatred, emotions, cognition, sensory motor changes, mind-body illnesses that often we call medically unexplained. So trauma involves, in this very powerful short book I recommend by Clara Mucci from Italy, a fear response for the whole. So we know that just overwhelming fear in the moment can lead us to fragment and dissociate the experience. But it becomes even more profound when linked with people hurting us. That leaves deeper and more foundational wounds, or with betrayal, when we start to talk about moral injury. And we're looking now at how trauma is passed down through the generations. So what is the impact of early adversity? Children subjected to repeated adverse childhood events will grow up to become adults with painful, shameful, and disowned identity states that shape a disorganized, fragmented, and conflicted sense of self. When confronted with traumatic reminders, their emotions are likely to swing rapidly, their reasoning may derail, and their behavior can swing out of control. They will have trouble learning from experience and forming healthy relationships. They dislike, even hate, and distrust themselves. And they will be vulnerable, I add, throughout life to additional trauma and victimization, which is why we now often add trauma and violence informed, because often these children with disrupted early lives go on to engage or get into relationships where there's violence, or perpetrators recognize them because of the signs that we may not notice that show that they're easy prey. And so often we've all had that experience as clinicians or researchers of working with people in trauma, and let's not romanticize them. Trauma does not make people nicer or easier to be with. It often makes them very difficult to be with. And so between that difficulty, that sense of difference and otherness, and the behaviors that were survival behaviors that actually don't serve in the present, we can become quite judgmental, and it's often hard for us to hide that. But sometimes we see other people, colleagues, that are actually very dismissive or shaming in the face of that. So the foundation of trauma and dissociation, it's important to know, is often in what did not happen. Often the people that go on to develop PTSD through war, through accident, through victimization, already were neglected, and research is increasingly showing that. Some of us know Harlow's monkeys experiments, where we wouldn't pass an ethics review now, but taking away real mothers from monkeys and giving a wire cage, they just curled up and died. The ones that survived had lifelong behavioral abnormalities, disordered sexuality, aggression. As soon as they even put soft cloth on the wire frames, already the monkeys did better, because the need to feel soothed is so deeply ingrained in us. We're not built in to survive and figure out life on our own. We also might have seen the still face experiment by Ed Tronick, where the mother disengages and the child first protests and within a minute collapses. So we have the now so much attachment research on the lifelong structural and functional effects on brain structure, physiology. And we now see that, especially looking at disorganized attachment, which affects 10% of the population, where attachment safety is mixed with terror and fear, where the people that can take care of you also can terrify you, and how that leads to dissociation and often to later life trauma across really the broad spectrum of mental illness. So what happens when parents, or now when we think about our patients, our research subjects are unsupported or stressed? Often my colleagues say in medicine, I don't treat trauma. In fact, they do treat trauma, and that's what the trauma-informed care is, because people are coming in with attachment injuries, with adversity. And so our misattunement, which that was often the pain of neglect, was just the person was not on the same wavelength of us. They didn't get us. We needed a hug and they gave us food or so forth. We were angry, they told us we were happy. And these get reactivated in the research interview and the clinical encounter, and can often lead to profound dysregulation. And we're like, what? I didn't do anything, I didn't say anything. But just a look, a posture, a feeling that you can't hold back can lead to quite triggering. We often in our world don't see the extent of dissociation. It's something that really isn't covered in the trauma teaching in the mainstream or in the DSM. So as a culture, we dissociate dissociation. So Ruth Lanius, who comes from your part of the world, together with Eric Vermetten and Claire Payne, comes from my part of the world. I've been fortunate to meet all three and feel close to Ruth and to Claire. It is ironic that people with complex trauma histories probably make up the bulk of patients seen in mental health centers, yet they remain nameless and diagnostically homeless. The clinical wisdom that results from intimate exposure to chronically traumatized people continues to be largely anecdotal. Because dissociation is of little interest of mainstream psychology and psychiatry, it is not systematically studied. So here we see, in a way, research being driven by people who have not treated trauma or have treated it very superficially, rather than those people that have been in the trenches. And one of my other lived experience, which I'm so grateful for the people that have trust in me, is to spend years with some people with complex trauma and just to see how it unwinds and unwinds and winds and takes us to the black hole of that early neglect, abandonment, terror, rage. This is a window of tolerance, which many of you know. It concerns our arousal or autonomic nervous system, and we're meant to just move smoothly in a regulated state. We're primarily in what we call ventrovagal, or tend and befriend, rest and digest. But trauma initially pushes us up and then eventually pushes us down again. And so often, just by understanding this, which any trauma-informed weekend introduction will teach us, will help us to see dysregulation in ourselves and in our clients or patients. And that in many therapists that first come to this are like, this just changed my practice, because I stopped trying to think for people or be cognitive when people were dysregulated, whether it was me or them, and find ways to come back through exercises like that little one I taught you, and there are many, many other ones. So we are always unconsciously monitoring for danger, and we know people with PTSD are monitoring like crazy. So when they come and sit with us in a research environment or in a clinical environment, the people that have had trauma, whether we know they've had trauma or not, their brain at the brainstem and midbrain level, their innate system, we call it, and we could talk about that, is just on all the time. So they are just looking for any cue of trauma. And that could even be some body change that comes with a question you ask that will just shoot them out of regulation and into survival physiology. We don't have to look at our work. We can look at a conversation on Twitter as well to see that happen. So initially, when we sense danger at that unconscious level, and people say, what were you thinking? But you weren't thinking, you were trying to survive. We go from fear to crying out for help, which often we see as in different ways. We can go into that at length. We panic, we go to flight, we go to fight, then we freeze, and we're in a high freeze when everything's tight, we're not breathing. And then eventually we collapse into shame, despair, and dissociation, which is where we don't want to go. But we cannot hold these high states for very long. So eventually we will collapse. And people write a lot now about how it's that collapse in the nervous system. I can no longer fight. I can no longer mobilize. That often accompanies our medically unexplained illnesses like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. And often when people trauma work with autoimmune diseases and other illnesses, we see the same. So when I came out of emergency medicine and I was looking at trauma people, I noticed that I often have psychiatric notes and people were talking, they're thinking this, they're thinking that, and their thought content is this. And I was saying, what about the fact that they're barely breathing, that their core is just rigid, that their face is pale or flushed? What would possibly happen if we shifted them out of that survival physiology? And often, lo and behold, the more I learned to work with the body, their thoughts just became normal again, because they were so linked to that survival. And so besides the danger we talk about, we also know there are protective factors like nurturing attachment, parents being supported, parental resilience, which often a mix that parents or caregivers have areas of resilience, areas of hurt, often extended family, we understand the importance of now, and things like care, and systems, because they can often offer support. And we want to bring that in our work, social connections, concrete supports that we can offer. And just some children with those supports become more socially and emotionally competent, while others go down the spiral. Sorry for another German slide. This is the only other one, but it's a reminder that trauma splits us, and every traumatic split means less and less healthy self. And we could spend hours talking about how we basically bury the rage, the humiliation, the hurt, the shame, and develop survival strategies. So if we look in the research world or the social policy world, we start to see that some things just don't feel like it's an expansive, open-hearted invitation, but there's a kind of rigidness, a franticness, a desperation. We have to do this, we have to do this. This is unacceptable, this is bad, that we're actually acting from our survival strategies. And so often we get two sets of survival strategies. So one is people, we have to do this, we have to do that. There's no way around it, very shrill. And then other people, especially people that have long-term ongoing trauma, like racialized trauma, they organize by going into compliance and appeasing, which is why we sometimes see a very few evil people or dogmatic, idealistic people can drag a lot of people to follow them. And we're like, what are those people thinking? Why are they obeying? But there's just so many faces of trauma. This is the neurosequential model. It's a reminder that I know I'm going fast, lots to cover, but we're on track, I think, that we do not relate thinking brain to thinking brain. That's sort of the end stage process. When we sit together, it's my autonomic nervous system, your autonomic nervous system, and my body to your body, which we'll talk about a little more. And then we send it up through the brainstem. Am I safe here? Through the higher, more affect-laden midbrain structures, again, monitoring for safety. And these structures are all, as we said, highly impacted by either early life subtle trauma or later life big trauma. And generally, they both go together, right? Look at soldiers with PTSD. Most of them actually have had pretty significant childhood trauma as well. A lot of people that go in the military actually do as well. Then we go to the relational, and then we go to the thinking system. So in the reference, Bruce Perry, who some of you will know, he's a child psychiatrist in the States. He's been on the scene for a long time and finally got brought into the mainstream by Oprah Perry, wrote a book, What Happened to You, about trauma-informed care that many of people you see with trauma histories who are aware may have read. So besides the window of tolerance, if that's number one, this might be number two that I would emphasize if you want to practice in a trauma-informed way without knowing a lot of trauma. It's to work neurosequentially. So Beacon House is a trauma-informed organization for traumatized children in the UK. I find in many ways I've been influenced more by the UK than by North America in this, because maybe they're a little ahead of us in because for various reasons, I'm not entirely sure why. And but it's the idea that in order to have a communication where our prefrontal cortex is online and we are being logical and meaning laden and in the present, we first need to regulate. So there's a cute video somewhere, the different iterations of it. But for instance, you see, I'm forgetting which prince it is, that when he's with his kids, you see in the photos, one of the royal family, he's always at their level, right? So, because just looking down on someone with trauma will activate it. There's another one, and it's a Black policeman and a Black child, and he's been misbehaving in the subway, and the Black policeman lies down on the subway platform. So again, they're regulating, they're co-regulating by being at the same level. They're eliminating the power imbalance. So whether it's an adult and child or somebody that might be from one race, another race, one gender, one sexuality, where there's a feeling of power imbalance. It's how do we create that co-regulation? And it can be very hard because people carry a lot of emotional memories, a lot of unconscious memories of harm. So we need to be patient with that. Keep trying and keep being curious. And, we try something, another thing, and try 5 things. And at the end of it, we want to say in a trauma-informed way, I'm curious, I feel like, I tried a lot and it's not landing, and I would really love for this to land. And I wonder if you can help me with something that might help you to feel calm or safe or connected here. And so we go as a process, and then we can relate. So we relate in a way, we speak in a voice that is accessible. Sometimes that's experimental too, because some people like it when you're really nice. Some people with trauma, being nice was often the prelude to their abuse, so they don't like it. So instead of having a cookbook way of being, we experiment with each person and find which way is relational for them. And then we reason, because once the prefrontal cortex is on way, we can begin to explore what might have been going on for you when this happened, so forth. I never ask why. If I ask why in the therapy session, I wonder what's going on for them, because it's really often puts trauma people, and we don't know who has trauma, on the defensive, or gets them too in their left brain, and they literally come up with answers that they think we want to hear, or their brain will just make up an answer that's not. So a lot of the trauma-informed language is, how was that for you? What could we do different? It invites reflection, and it invites more open. Another thing that works well in trauma-informed language is a menu. People with trauma love menus. They're often overwhelmed by those open questions, shut down by the why. So if we say, well, if we could offer you a taxi chat, a meal, a different room with more warm and welcoming, what might be the one that speaks to you the most? That goes over well. The traumatized brain just likes that. And that gets me through a lot of difficult therapy sessions. This is a reminder that for many of us now, many of the people I'm seeing, so the greatest pain in my life right now is I feel alone in the crowd. So I won't read this all, but there's certainly ongoing trauma. And that's why now, in the difficulty in the last few years, there's no post and post-traumatic stress disorder. The trauma, the alienation, the moral injury is changing. But even people talk about pre-traumatic stress, because people are so scared of, oh, it might get worse. We're seeing things coming. Where also the trauma field has really moved into the idea that we're in a village, and that the psychosocial aspects of trauma are completely inseparable from the personal ones. So we look at adverse community environments that affect us: poverty, community disruption, violence, discrimination, lack of opportunity, economic mobility, social capital, poor housing quality, affordability. We also look at adverse babyhood experiences, sometimes like traumatic births that happen in hospital. So it's really a matrix of things. And because trauma is so complicated and so in this matrix of what's good and bad, we begin to look at, how do we research how to create environments, social settings, psychosocial environments that include everything from the mitochondria to the cell, to the family, to the community environment. Everything from the HPA access to, does people have access to green spaces, and how do we work this? So there we are, and then I'm moving to more trauma-informed care. So that's a very quick intro. The trauma-informed care weekend introduction would probably spend about half the weekend getting you to know trauma in that. So we've done it very quickly, and I will answer questions at the end, and I'm sure you'll have some, because this is not simple or straightforward. But I must honor researchers, because when I started teaching about this in 2012, I had very little research to go on. It was very triggering for people. Older doctors would literally walk out the room. Other people didn't tend to, but very hard on medical doctors to hear that say someone with an ACE score of 6 had a 20-year reduction in life expectancy. Why weren't we taught this in school? What this is about? It can't be true. Now I get fed through social media, some of the people I connect with, research studies every day, really elaborating on the lifelong effects of early childhood adversity, going right up to Alzheimer's disease and dementia. I love this quote. It goes back. I've had this so many years. It's written by Shani Boanju. And she wrote, this is after her active military training, had it not been for someone who understood a problem for which I had no words, I might have gone mad. And she's not saying, they said, oh, you must have complex trauma and the military exacerbated it. They're saying someone just got her. Someone said, maybe you're just feeling, or I wonder if, or am feeling, or am sensing. And so that's going to bring me to my third point, that if we want to be trauma-informed, we need to understand those neurosequentiality of interacting with people and the profound effect that our body language, or what we call our implicit language, or tone of voice, the look in our eyes, can impact people. We want to understand how to re-regulate people, the autonomic nervous system window of tolerance, and we want to be real. If we're not real, if we're not authentic, if we're in our own trauma, even if our trauma is idealism, it's, we have to do this, it's, you know, I learned that from hard experience. It's not relational, it's not real. We want to come from where our heart, our mind, our body join. So I'm just going to do a couple of things off the slide. We're going to ignore the 5 key principles, which are now 6. So Sandra Bloom, who created the sanctuary model, in fact, I heard in Belfast the same time I first heard Bruce Perry in 2010. It's a reminder that when we move to trauma-informed institutions, if we institute them without instituting them at the organizational cultural level, it's like throwing seeds on dry land. And also, the way I best understand trauma-informed care is, okay, we know about trauma, but we don't know who has it. Just like as an ER doctor, I knew about HIV and AIDS, I knew about hepatitis C, but I didn't know who had it. So I didn't check everybody's blood work or even ask everybody. I just assumed they might have it. I wore gloves. Just like if you're going into trauma-informed care as a gynecologist, you're not going to ask everybody, were you sexually abused as a child? You just assume that they may have been, and you're gentle. You explain everything. Would you like me to warm the speculum? Is there anything else that could make you safer? So the 4 R's, we have the recognizing, responding, realizing, and the most important of all, our systems do re-traumatize. Our medical system in North America is still the #1 cause of big T trauma. People, I hear just horror stories that go on to this day of people that go into psychiatric evaluations and that are made to tell their story over and over again and then told there's nothing for you or the wait is 2 years. And it's just devastating because every time they repeat that story, they're reliving the physiology of the original trauma. And people literally decompensate. And I'm often in peer review or peer study groups where we talk about the harm that's caused. So we want to stop that re-traumatization. And when we look at that trauma split model, we see how an institution can on one level be extremely oppressive, hierarchical, and at the same time be pushing equality, diversity, inclusion. It could be giving voice to some people and completely silencing other people that go against their, what might trigger their own helplessness or vulnerability, which they can't tolerate in that. So when I first told some of my colleagues I'm invited to talk about trauma-informed care, they were, oh, please let them talk about trauma, because they know so much of trauma-informed care ends up being rather paradoxically not performative, tokenistic. But we're aiming, and the field is changing, to do the best we can to make the best of it. So these are slides. I won't go through all of it, but in the traditional non-trauma-informed approach, we ask what's wrong with you in trauma-informed care. We're interested in what happened to you, who's there for you, who was there for you at the time. In the medical model I'm used to, we're symptom focused still for my quality improvement. People are quite happy if I say I relieve symptoms, even if I'm doing nothing at the level of causation and trauma. Lots of way to go. But in trauma-informed care, we view the whole person in the environment, the assessment, the treatment. So whether we're working clinically or in research, we really want to know, with our people, who's there for you? Who was there for you before you came? Who's going to be there for you after you leave? We want to understand behaviors, communication, if we're in trauma-informed education. And little Johnny, who's generally quite quiet, is acting out and loud and noisy. We don't want to have him stand in the corner or shame him or re-traumatize him. We want to be curious and say, you've been pretty good the last few months. Is something going on? Are your parents fighting again? Did you get anything to eat for breakfast today? How are your siblings doing? We want to be inclusive in the biopsychosocial assessment. We want to be participatory. We're doing this together, collaboratory as well. And we want to understand that people need safety and protection first, but they need that at a nervous system level. So we don't want to say you're safe here. People know better than that. We want to create conditions that create a relative sense of safety. So we want warm and welcoming spaces. We want a tone of voice to be welcoming. We want that to start at the front door and go all the way to the top. So we want to move from deficit-based perspective to a trauma-informed and strength-based perspective. For time, I won't go over that. But that whole looking at people as malingerers to seeing them trying to survive and using what worked before. This is a reminder that re-traumatization happens at many different levels, at both the individual and system level. So when we get together and do our institutional training and bring in people, and people are going to be different, but we want to really sit and talk about these things. It's hard to just look at a slide. These are things that really need to be dialogued. So is trauma-informed care just about being sweet, nice, and kind? No, it's not just about the fruit bowl at the entrance. And as I said, it's really about being real, that you're there, that you're embodied, that you're not bringing your performative, oh, I'm calm, I'm nice. You're bringing your deep whole self into the interaction, because that's what people want. And that you're watching, you're interacting, you're seeing your impact on their body and their impact on your body. To be attuned, to be compassionate. So there are no shortcuts. Karen Treisman, who was just knighted for her work in trauma-informed care in the UK, is talking about how you can't just go in a one-off and be trauma-informed over a weekend. You really need to infuse the whole organization with an understanding of what trauma is, what trauma-informed care is, and promoting a culture of care, safety, and healing. And this is the kind of graphic she does. She has a book on creating trauma-informed organizations, lots of videos. Enchem and Defoe, who I've corresponded with a bit, is doing work, anti-oppression work, trauma-informed transition work in San Francisco. A reminder of the bodies, like Resmaa Mannequin talks about as well, white bodies, black bodies, how the different bodies sort of hold the oppression, and just to make it cognitive doesn't address what's held in the body. So an embodied approach, she tweeted, is critical to anti-oppression work. People need to be able to recognize when they are disconnected and overwhelmed. People need tools to come back to themselves and to each other in ways that support our mutual liberation. And that, in a nutshell, is when we talk about our own self-care, which is necessary because we can't care for others unless we can care for ourselves. So how do we become connected? How do we recognize overwhelm? What are the tools we need to come back to ourselves and our bodies? There's research about trauma-informed care. We're talking about trauma-informed care in research, but it's been researched, and you can access University of Bristol. It's ongoing. And, it's actually not as happy as we'd like it to be. And they're finding one of the obstacles, and it's something that we can discuss, or that they invite you to discuss, is how do you take a medical system, a mental health system, education system, care system that's falling apart, and tell people you have to add this other layer. So the limited experience they have right now, and they've looked at it in quite a sophisticated way, looking at people with lived experience, is that it does seem to help our patient client population. They've done a lot of work in primary care. So we're saying patients, it does not seem to make lives of clinicians easier. And so trauma-informed care has a long way to go in addressing that well-being of clinicians. We look at trauma-informed research. There's a few papers I found actually right at the last minute. So one author says, or group of authors, for a research endeavor to be trauma-informed, it must involve understanding trauma, which we touched on, planning studies and sharing decision-making with participants, being collaborative, being prepared to respond to trauma throughout research for everyone involved. So when are people we see traumatized, when are we traumatized, what are the resources our institution can hold that we can send them to, because often we don't have the resources ourselves. We want to use a trauma-informed approach to research because it encourages human-centeredness, not just outcomes. It creates safer environments for participants on both sides. We're in this together. It guides collaboration between researchers and participants, and it creates a safer and more sustainable work environment for us, the researchers or clinicians. Just so important. We can't, our trauma has often led to us putting ourselves either on top or on the bottom, feeling too little or too much, but we want to create that evenness, that eyes are at equal level. These are now what we call the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. We want to create safety, which I've mentioned. We want to create trust. And often the people that come to us, we can see that in veterans with moral injury, but in just about anyone with trauma or poverty or any kind of social hardship. See that going into a prison, see that in going on social media. How do we build trust? How does our organization build trust? Peer support is important. The system cannot fully support people. So in research, we ask our people, who can you bring in to help, who might be supportive? We want collaboration and mutuality. We want to give empowerment. We want to give people a voice. I think medicine in my own backyard, and I don't see that in psychotherapy, is so hurt because the leaders just do not give voice to the outliers. They don't give voice to the people that could make a difference. They're so dissociated for their need to silence people and take away voice. And sometimes they do that by selectively giving a very loud voice to someone that fits into their, well, I'm this far over into the trauma-informed care, so I'll make this person a big person. Just the way anti-stigma works, I'll take away stigma from someone who has mild depression and goes to a psychiatrist and takes their drugs, but we're not going to look at that very angry person with severe trauma and morbidity with addiction and so forth. And we want to be attuned to cultural, historical, and gender issues, which means dedicated study and communication with one another. We really can't study this alone. We need the support of one another, or we get overwhelmed. So we as clinicians and researchers, hearing stories of trauma, just taking it in nervous system to nervous system without even knowing it, we got what Laura Van Dernert-Lipsky calls the trauma exposure response, which really combines burnout, compassion, fatigue, vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, all these different labels we give people. And we see it in people. And again, we remember that slide, they're ramping up. And what we don't want to do is we want to intervene, we want to take people aside before they crash. And often the biggest challenge for me in doing the work is finding that the people that really need it don't show up. And the people that are doing pretty well are being proactive and they're coming to self-care. And they're doing good, they're protecting themselves. But how do we create a system that catches people more at risk, that are already disorganized or dissociated? So the 3 pillars of well-being, Otto Sharma, who does a lot of work in presencing and creating decentralized methods of change, community of changes. We need connection to nature. One person I'm quite close to who works for Toronto Public Health has said, just how demoralized she is because they keep pulling her out of green space when the research shows how overwhelmingly helpful it could be, but it's not politically. The traumatized political system wants to work on other things. And that even though the overarching research would show they're working on things that are not in the best interest of people. We want to connect with others and we want to connect with ourselves, including our body. So that often involves protected time, which we're not given. Often we're thrown just, here's some online modules to teach you to meditate, which actually a very bad thing unless you're a very regulated person. And people with trauma, please don't tell them to meditate unless they're trauma sensitive. They need to move, they need things that are trauma informed in that. So here we see yoga, which often is a good intervention if done gently and mindfully. And a lot of my best trauma-informed interventions I learned from yoga teachers because somehow the trauma-informed language entered their community quickly, that kind of collaborative, if it's all right with you, if this is available to you, and to be in this together. And that togetherness includes the people in the corner. It includes us really listening to everybody, including people that we don't like. It's to be together in community. We have to listen to all of us. In my own work, I've done work over the pandemic and before with different healthcare providers and patients, but especially with healthcare providers, what I found is when Irina and I were just doing heavy-duty somatic regulation and taking 9 weeks, very trauma, understanding trauma, the effect on the nervous system, the brain stem, HAPA axis, so forth, and then worked on tracking and being able to do a lot of different interventions to get regulation. So the relating and reasoning could follow. It just wasn't enough. People needed connection. People are very isolated now. So I found, and it's still a work in progress, and we actually need a ton of research that nobody's really doing, I think, a lot yet on what works. But I found people, if we did about 10 or 15 minutes of somatic work in a way that was trauma-informed, collaborative, that brought people together, that then we could go ahead and be relational and have that deep sharing where the space felt safe, authentic, real, that people could just show up as they were. This is my final slide. It's from Sensory-Motor Psychotherapy Institute. They did a webinar. I'm not sure if it's available on quick interventions for war. So this is something if you're going to the Ukraine, say, and working with a lot of people that are very broken, that may have a hard time linking with you because you might regulate with a warm bath and something nice to smell. They might be regulated by going to a rave. That might be the only thing that would meet them at their level of dysregulation. But anyways, the basic protocol, they call a peace protocol, and they go into much more detail, is that we track our body when we're triggered. We become very good at noticing early shifts rather than late shifts. We embody a resource, and we have a list on there. I think you'll be able to access the PDF of mine. I'm happy for you to have it. And we do just different interventions and deepen them so they work. And other people like Rick Hansen do this. And then we gradually build those resources to bring us back quite quickly to the environment. I have my references and I have where to find me on Twitter or the website. So now I'm going to come back and I think I'm pretty much to the moment. So always hard with a new talk to know when it'll end.
Yes, no, you timed that perfectly, and I think you hit on so many extremely important points. I'm going to start with the questions to give some people the chance to think about it. One of the things I found listening is that there was really so many points of connection. In my personal research, I work. One of my research areas is around homelessness. Another is around people using substances. So, as you can imagine, pretty much everyone that we interview, we have to be so careful. But one of the things when you're talking about dissociation that I've really found, and I find often difficult, is that it can come at anywhere, anytime, and it's not necessarily where you expect to see it. So, for example, in one of our earlier studies with people with lived experience of homelessness, said we have to be talking about early childhood trauma and abuse. Of course, ethics was having a fit on that. When we introduced that, we very much talked about, we're asking these questions because the people with lived experience of homelessness thought it was important. If you're uncomfortable, we gave people contact information for after. Most of the people actually thanked us for asking that question, said they hadn't revealed it. But what they called us about was a totally different question, by far the most common question, and that was, where is it you would like to live? Because many people said they were homeless and then called us back and said, that's not true. But as I thought about it, it was very triggering because I feel I have no choice. So we were really worried about the early childhood trauma and abuse questions, but in fact, it was a very different question. So I think if you're not trying to be aware during the whole time and give people a chance, you can be really surprised. At least I can be very surprised. I don't know about other people, by what actually can create this. I just wondered if you wanted to comment on being available for the unexpected.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we know that talking about trauma can be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and then you have to pull camel together again. So it's a very delicate point, and certainly trauma-informed care, the philosophy is not to go in the trauma in that, and to maybe say something like, I understand that you've had some very painful experiences, and I want you to know that if this was the setting, I would believe you, but that I understand risks as well, and that and to sort of shift the discussion more to creating safety now. And I'll often warn people that I know what happens when you don't feel safe and connected and have a support system, that things can go bad. So I would love to hear about it in the right setting. And I think for most homeless people, like, we'll never have enough trauma therapists, and we'd be a lot smarter doing what they're doing in Helsinki now and eliminating homelessness.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like it's so intertwined. I'm just wondering, Melissa, are you seeing any questions show up?
Yeah, there's a few questions in the Q&A on the app. Would you like me to read a couple out?
Yes, because I'm not seeing them. I've got it here on my phone, and I'm not seeing them for some reason.
No problem. So in the chat, Glorious asks, could you talk more about the subtle trauma symptoms that don't fit the DSM diagnostics, that go untreated but really affect people's ability to relate and function?
Yes. And actually, the book by Kathleen Adams is very interesting because she's really looking at high-functioning people with trauma. So they're people that look good on the outside, but they still had their traumas. They had their moments when they froze in terror, abandonment, maybe a mom with postpartum depression, a family with domestic abuse or alcoholism, And so you build a kind of personality, but you still have the triggers. And often those people, they have difficulty with relationships. They have difficulty with jobs. They just don't feel happy. They're in psychoanalysis for 5 years, still don't feel better. They can't seem to hold on to money. When you start to look at their sexuality, it's more dissociative. That's one that's often missed, that people cannot be fully present during sexuality. And porn is a great way to pull them into a bad world, because a lot of what's out there actually feeds on subtle trauma and takes advantage of it. And then when you get into the mind-body illnesses, it's very difficult. But when you start to see subtle, unexplained symptoms, it's actually the interaction of trauma and physiology. So that's a sign for me when I see people come in and they have very difficult symptoms, like with Oprah, like she couldn't regulate her thyroid despite all the blood tests in that, because when they start to see, instead of nice rhythms and axes in the physiology, and things are kind of jumpy and cortisol's here and then here, or thyroid, then I'm also thinking about subtle signs of trauma. It just, life tends to be harder for those people in that. So if we see hardship and there's no obvious explanation, I think subtle trauma, but then the question is what you do with that subtle trauma, in that, what are the best resources for it. In that, but mostly in the interview, when we're actually working with people one-on-one, I want to see those moments I'm looking for when they freeze, when they go into a fight, when they go into a flight. And I want to identify, because those are markers for me that they've gone into survival physiology, even in a little subtle way. So if I catch them when they just start to seize up and start breathing, I'll probably intervene before they're in a full-on fight or flight response. We can de-escalate.
Melissa, I'm still not seeing the questions, so I'll leave the questions if there's one or two more.
Sorry, yeah, there's two more up. So Alicia asks, most academic programs are not teaching polyvagal theory. This makes it very hard to have a framework of the human nervous system. Do you feel the understanding of the polyvagal framework and a good understanding of the nervous system is imperative for providers and researchers who engage in trauma and violence-related work?
Yes. I think there is such a disconnect between academics and the real world. And, we could go into that at length. But, these academics is not looking at people with complex trauma and treating them. At most they're analyzing some very short-term interventions, and it's very beholden to funding and that. But it's unfortunate, because some people that come out of academics, it takes them years, and they're so grateful that they learned what they needed to survive in the trenches. Whether it's war or therapy or research, to really get it right, you have to get it right. And you have a body-to-body human connection with another person. And I think a lot of the more anti-oppression activist writers are talking about trauma and polyvagal. If you went to anyone like NCAM or Resma Manikin or many, many others, they'll certainly be on board with nervous system regulation. In fact, the ICD definition of the complex trauma that includes disorders of self-organization, affect regulation, emotion regulation, arousal regulation is one of the cornerstones of complex trauma. And they're using that as a research tool. So hopefully the research in North America will catch up to the research in Europe on that.
And you said there's one more, Melissa?
Yeah, we have one more from Ashraf. So how successful are we with rehabilitation and harm reduction strategies with these traumatized individuals? Well,
again, it's important to recognize that, trauma-informed framework is within a whole world of psychosocial stressors and resources. So it's all in balance. And, I think we can all have a gut feeling of how successful or unsuccessful we are in that. But I end with Karen Treisman's words that every interaction can be a meaningful moment. I just had a mental block on her words in that in those fields, every time you look at somebody and relate to them as a human being, you may be changing the trajectory of your whole life. We don't know how to study that. We don't know how a way a person's related to may make the difference between whether they choose to live or commit suicide, whether they may choose violence or not choose violence, whether they may, in Black psychiatrist Heather Hoffman states words, succumb to social defeat, I give up, I'm done, nothing matters, or continue to stay in the game of life. So even without the research, I really encourage us all to be humane, to be heart-centered, to value care of ourselves and others, and each other.
So thank you so much. I think that was I think for those who are here as clinicians, I know we've got people in leadership positions at the hospital, as well as researchers. And I think the comments, the examples, the frameworks really touch all of our work, regardless of where we are, as well as the self-reflection as we interact with people. So I thank you for that. And I will hand over to Melissa to talk about just to help people navigate our new system for the next step of the program.
Thank you for having me.